Managing risk in an enterprise means assessing it first. You can't manage what you don't know about. So with risk assessments, what we're talking about doing is prioritizing threats against assets within the organization and then determining what to do about those threats. That's part of risk management. Now, this would apply to doing a risk assessment for the entire organization, but in a larger enterprise, often what you'll find is that a risk assessment is done on a subset, maybe a particular project. Is it worth embarking on? Or maybe it's for a specific department or a specific system that's about to be deployed or a company merger or acquisition. So we don't have to have a risk assessment at a global scale, meaning for the entire enterprise. It could be for smaller units within the enterprise. Now, the targets of the risk assessment could be individual servers, for example, or legacy systems. In other words, older systems that might have some known vulnerabilities, but we might require them to use some software. It happens. Or perhaps the theft of intellectual property or IP. We want to assess that type of risk to find out what would happen if that threat was realized and what we can do about it to implement controls to mitigate against that threat. We might have threats related to software licensing. In other words, not being compliant with software license agreements can sometimes mean that fines are levied against organizations. That is a risk that we have to consider. We want to make sure we're in compliance so that we don't incur those fines. So that's one aspect of risk assessments. The other thing that we need to think about is the process that is involved in conducting a risk assessment. Now, first of all, for the people conducting the assessment, there needs to be an awareness of cybersecurity threats. That goes all the way back to the threat intelligence sources that we talked about. So having an awareness of the risk. Then evaluating security controls. There is always some kind of residual risk that will remain when you partake in anything that might have some kind of benefit. Just like there's always some kind of a risk when you step out the door in the morning on your way to work of something bad happening. Doesn't mean we don't partake in the activity, but we just consider it and try to reduce the impact if it was going to happen. So that means that we need to implement security controls and review them periodically, because a security control that's effective today in mitigating some kind of a threat may no longer be effective 6 months down the road. So it's important that we do this periodically, continuous monitoring of the efficacy of security controls. Now, there are a bunch of different types of risks, such as environmental risks. We've all experienced this in one way or another over time, whether it's a hurricane or a flood that might result in things like power outages. There are person-made type of risks that we have to consider. These are things like riots, acts of terrorism, intentional sabotage, those types of things. Other risks would be internal to the organization, like a malicious insider, or sometimes you have innocent insiders that unintentionally unleash malware. That is a risk we have to consider. So malware infections. External risks might include perhaps other nation states or other competitors that might issue distributed denial of service attacks against one of our servers, one of our networks, to prevent any legitimate traffic from getting to it. So we have to think about these types of things. Now, we've talked about assessing risk and some of the types of risks to consider. What do we do about it? That's called a risk treatment. And there are a couple of categories of risk treatments. The first of which is mitigating or reducing risk. This means that we put security controls in place proactively before engaging in that risky activity so that we can mitigate or control any negative impacts. There's risk transference, which is also called risk sharing. This means that some risk that is related to engaging in an activity is transferred to another party. Think about things like insurance, fire insurance, or even cybersecurity insurance to protect against attacks occurring. Other risk treatments would include things like risk avoidance. This means that we don't even partake in a given activity. It's too risky. In other words, the potential benefits do not come near to outweighing the risks. So we don't partake at all. Risk acceptance means that we accept the risk currently as it is. It falls within the organization's risk appetite, but we're not going to put a security control in place to mitigate that risk. And that's where risk acceptance and risk mitigation or reduction are different. They are not the same. It's kind of like if you want to go swimming in a lake, there is going to be a risk that you might drown, as small as that might be. So accepting or mitigating that might be you putting on a life jacket and then going swimming. But avoiding that means not jumping in the water at all. So there is a difference between some of these different types of risk treatments. So now when it comes to managing risk, we know that we have to consider how to conduct a risk assessment for the whole organization or just a department, for example. We have to have a sense of the different types of risks that would apply in our particular case, and then how to treat or manage those risks.